I'd like to call the February IAC meeting to order. It is now 9 o'clock, and I'm happy to see that we have all of our members here today that could be here, and we do have a quorum, and I understand that we do not have any public comment today. So we're going to go ahead with the approval of the minutes. If I could have a motion to approve.
So moved.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Senator Laylaw. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? All right, motion carries to approve the minutes from December the 12th.
Correspondence.
Okay, so welcome, Elliot. We do have some IAC correspondence to call your attention to, and Bob, do you want to discuss that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We received, and you're aware because you were copied with our response, a letter on January 10th that regarding the Hammond High School in Howard County. We responded to that on January the 17th, and again, you were copied. The issue is really about limited funds. The high school that they were asking for, the Hammond High School, the renovations, additions in that, was a lower priority than the projects that they had provided to us with higher priorities, such as the Talbot Elementary, which was partially funded, and the new high school, which they passed some continued funding to. In their letter, they close it by saying they are committed to equity in our school system, which is a good plug for our assessment system, and I can say that that's starting to move forward, and that will make it a little easier for everybody to be able to understand the relative needs.
Very good.
Thank you.
Any questions on that for Bob? All right. Let's move to Section 2, which is the long-awaited Maryland Guidelines and Best Practices for the Design, Assessment, and Modification of Physical Facilities and Spaces to Reduce Opportunities for Child Sexual Abuse. I'm going to let Cassandra address that, but I want to say that I want to thank the staff. They've been working very, very diligently to get this completed. And I think we finally have a good collaborative product. And I also want to thank my special assistant, Zach Hands, for his work on this process as well. So Cassandra.
Yes, Madam Chair. So you'll see on page 32 a motion for the adoption of the Maryland Guidelines and Best Practices for the Design, Assessment, and Modification of Physical Facilities and Spaces to Reduce Opportunities for Child Sexual Abuse. This is based upon legislation that passed in 2018, which required the IAC and the State Council on Child Abuse and Neglect to jointly develop these guidelines and best practices. The legislation also requires that each county board develop policies and procedures to address this issue. So we hope that these guidelines give them a good starting point for that effort. This is a very important issue, and the prevalence of it may not always be recognized. The ratio of students affected by child sexual abuse versus other forms of violence is astounding. On page 37 of the agenda, you'll see an introductory section where it explains that anywhere from 1 to 10% of students will experience sexual abuse or misconduct by a school employee. When you think about how many students there are in Maryland schools, that is an astounding number. So these guidelines include resources provided by the CDC and also best practices such as the situational prevention approach and crime prevention through environmental design, which really is a standard practice for the design of new schools. That's something that architects are doing anytime they design a school facility. It also takes administrative policies and enforcement to balance the threats faced by schools today. So many of the principles that help to protect against child sexual abuse and may conflict with those that are best practices for things like safety. We talk about this a lot. So one easy example of that is that for school safety, for security in the event of an active shooter or some other threat, you need to have an area of visual refuge. That directly conflicts with the principle that to prevent child sexual abuse, you need open areas. So how you administratively address that is by doing things like installing blinds that are kept up the majority of the time, but can be pulled down in a situation. So I do want to plug our newsletter real quick. If you saw when it went out, we talked about Samuel Mudd Elementary School in Charles County. And they did install blinds, which is a best practice, but administratively, some schools struggle with their teachers pulling down blinds to block sun or whatever it is outside of that. So to address that, they made the administrative decision to install these really plain, almost like black vinyl blinds, so that when they're pulled down, they're really unattractive. And that encourages the teachers to keep them up. We did a tour of the whole school, and I didn't see one blind pulled down except when they showed me how they worked. It was really impressive. So those kinds of administrative efforts can really help to support the physical improvements that we put in place and are arguably more important. So the guidelines and best practices are recommendations for elements that should be considered by each school, as well as recommendations for a constant feedback loop so that strategies can continually be improved. During the creation of these guidelines, we were very aware of the recommendation from the work group on educational development specifications that the IAC be cautious of imposing any additional requirements on the LEAs. So I really want to note here that these are guidelines and best practices that are a resource for the LEA, but they don't impose any requirements. And with that, I can stand for questions.
Questions for Cassandra on this document of best practices? Senator?
Doesn't matter. Whatever. I just had a question about the first sentence under the magnitude of child abuse. You have between 1 in 100 and 1 in 10 students will experience sexual abuse. I mean, that's a big range.
It is a huge
I mean,
range
what's the
because
number?
it's often underreported. Experts estimate that the number of incidents far exceed the number of reports. So it is something that there is a broad range between.
But when you come up with 90,000, what does that equate to in terms of percentages?
That equates to 1 in 10.
1 in 10.
Yes, so that is
Big number.
the highest number that is possible
Okay.
based on the best estimate we can get from experts.
Is there a better way to make that statement?
Yeah.
Because I share that concern, now that you bring it up. The other thing that I think should, I don't want to wordsmith, but I do think we should identify this as nationwide statistics, not just in Maryland schools, because
Yes,
you
Madam
don't
Chair.
want people to think in our 1,428 schools that we have that high of an incidence. So I would maybe want to make that clear. Secretary?
Yes, the other question is, the reference from that research, is the research about child sexual abuse in schools or child being sexually abused? It's item 3 in the on page 50.
Yes. Give me 1 second. And I do have to apologize. Joan Schaefer was our expert on this and fostered this through the end. So she, unfortunately, has retired.
Members, on page 50, all of the references are there. And in the majority of these are national surveys that they have drawn upon. And I want to point out that one of the requests that they had asked that, and actually we really talked them down from it being a requirement, is this checklist for tracking specific incidents. Because currently there's not a way to capture this information. And I think, as Cassandra said, having real data seems to be difficult at this point.
I think Bob's point, though, is that the study that's referenced does not talk about where this occurs.
Yeah.
So I think his question is really valid, and we need to check that out.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay? I think it's
I'm
correct.
a fan of preventing it anywhere it happens, but I'm not a fan of highlighting the potential that it's happening in the schools if it's not based on research that's about schools.
Right.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, any other concerns or questions about the report?
And Madam Chair, would you like for us to bring this back to the next meeting with revisions? We did invite Scan here to be able to answer questions, and they were unable to attend. But we could recommend some changes and then bring them back next time?
I think that would be good, just for us
Right.
to see it, and then it would give members another time to reflect on the
Very good.
material again.
Thank you.
And that way, if there's other issues, they could email Cassandra with questions, and then we can kind of finalize everything in
Yeah.
March.
And it'd be good to have Scan here, I believe, to be able to answer questions.
You want to stipulate what SCAN stands for?
Oh, thank you.
It is the State Council on Child Abuse and Neglect.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I just have a couple other items that, they're not big. At the bottom of page 38, second line from the bottom, you've got an and there that needs to be, a strike through that needs to come out.
Yes.
And on page 40, in the paragraph under guidelines for implementing best practices, my suggestion is for some, maybe just put it in bold, but that third sentence that says, for example, because we have to remind people about the conflict between protecting and shielding when we go into shield mode. So we need to highlight the concept that that the blinds not be closed, that the doors not be closed, that things can't be locked unless we're in that kind of a lockdown situation. So anytime we do that, I think it's good. It shows that we recognize that there's the tension here and that they have to somehow justify why those things are done. So if someone walks by in the non-emergency situation to see the blinds down, that is an incident that needs to be reported in and of itself. So that becomes the culture in the school system that everything is open unless there's
Well, except for the doors. We are advising that all doors should be locked at all times.
That's fine, that's fine.
That's why we have the special locks. So when I visit schools, that's something I look for. I don't want to see that you can get into a classroom without having that barrier there. That's that first barrier. I totally agree with your comments about the blinds, but the doors must be kept locked.
That's fine, I have no dispute
Okay.
with that. And my last thing is on page 49,
Yeah, you can.
the bullet from the bottom, that methods of obscuring sight lines.
Cannot.
I don't know if there's any suggestion on reporting
This is a scary statement.
when it occurs outside of
More than 10 kids.
an emergency situation.
Change that.
So, when you find the doors unlocked, when you find
Right.
the blinds are down, maybe there should be consideration of reporting that this situation was found. Because if you end up finding 3 reports of the situation, then you may be able to track it down to a specific person on duty at the time, with something like that. So it becomes kind of a reportable thing. Just if it was a hospital situation and somebody hung the wrong IV, they'd report it and say, until you find the pattern and figure out how to fix that problem. So, and that's just my suggestion, and I'm not the expert, and I'm just trying to make sure that if we have guidelines, they don't have to adopt a reporting requirement. We could suggest it. That's just my
And we'll take care of that. I just spoke with Bob. The unlocked doors is definitely a conflict, and we need to make sure we get that straight. Can't give out 2 sets of guidelines.
Right, conflicting, right. So
Anything else?
that's all for me.
All right. Thank you very much, and we'll bring this back for a final read in March. Okay, we're now going to move to Section 3, which is our 90% of our IAC staff recommendations for capital improvements. In Arabia, we welcome you back. And this is on pages 52 to 67, Section 3 of your book. Good morning.
Okay. So if we can turn to page 54, and I can walk you through
Okay.
those changes. We can begin with column C. The total amount of funding being requested increased by $114,000. This is due to an adjustment to the state local cost share for the Sandy Hill roof project in Dorchester County. Column E, which is the 90% round, in Calvert County, staff are recommending that $173,000 of new authorization be removed from the Patuxent High HVAC project, and that the LEA's prior year appropriations be applied in May. If the IAC supports this recommendation, we ask that the $173,000 be applied to the Dinard Elementary Roof HVAC project in St. Mary's County. At the December meeting, Caroline County stated that they only needed $13.5 million instead of $14 million that was recommended for the Greensboro Elementary School project. So in May, column F, in a yellow highlight, staff are recommending that the project be reduced by $487,000, and a portion of those funds be applied to the boiler project at Lead Elementary and Chesapeake City replacement in Cecil County, and the Sandy Hill Roof project in Dorchester County. The remaining $6,000 is recommended to be held in the state's reserve fund. I am available for questions. These were very minor changes.
All right, questions for Arabia on these changes? Yes, Secretary McCord?
Just one. Arabia, what is the last hunk of money that represents the full 100%? How
That
much?
would be the 10%. It'll
The
be
10%, right.
Yes, it'll be $28 million.
28 million. Just confirming that. Thank you.
Yes.
All right, hearing no questions at this point, would you read the motion, please?
Yes. To adopt the fiscal year 2021 90% capital improvement program, IAC recommendations for each school system and the Maryland School for the Blind totaling $252 million as shown in the summary of project requests and recommendations, and to provide the recommendations to the presiding officers and the budget committees of the General Assembly and the Department of Legislative Services.
All right, do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second? Second. We have a second. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Arabia. Good work on this, and also the designees. Thank you for your recommendations.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move to Section 4, which is the facilities change items, the status of that, and we have Michael to walk us through there. We're going to start with Section 4A. Michael, welcome.
Great, good morning,
Good morning.
Commissioners. Just a couple of facility changes this month. We'll mention that we have a number of site approvals that are in process we'll be bringing to you in the coming months, and we have one today in Frederick County. And this is the Brunswick Elementary School project. The county and the Board of Education are in the process of acquiring a parcel adjacent to the existing Brunswick Elementary School with the intention of combining the properties, and then they're in the process of planning the school itself, which would then be constructed on the same site. I will note that if you look at the background here, the entire site would be about 41 acres. The site to be acquired is 16.7, immediately to the east of the existing school. The existing parcel is about 25 acres. The site was offered to the Board of Education at no cost as part of a subdivision approval. It's a plan unit development project there that's being built out. There's a little bit of background in there. At build out, the project that's adjacent would have about 1,500 residential units there. So the project is still in the planning stage, and we're working with them on that as well. I will note that one thing that was flagged in the clearinghouse process was that a determination of eligibility by of historic resource and significance had not been completed to date, and so in the recent conversations I've been having with staff, Frederick County schools, I understand that to be in process. So all of that would be ongoing with the rest of the development and planning process, and will be submitted to the designees for their review and approval as that project moves forward. So I don't know if you have any questions about this. It's a fairly straightforward site approval process otherwise.
Questions for Michael? Secretary McCord?
I think I may have asked earlier, but do you remember how old the school is?
I believe the school was actually constructed, it's in the notes here, in 1952.
All right, that's where it is.
And they
Thank
had a couple of additions in 59 and 78, and there was a major renovation in 1980.
No, thank you. You briefed me on that. I was trying to remember. The concept
Yes.
is that since the Maryland Historical Trust is underneath the planning, as we go through the process of dealing with all kinds of buildings in the state system, schools and otherwise,
Right.
that as the age progresses, the need to consider them as potential historic resources is what has to happen to them. right, that has to occur. So that's what happens in the clearinghouse process. It's all working the way it should.
Sure.
But it's just the age of the buildings
Right.
puts them in historic status. So, thank you.
Correct. And we did facilitate a conversation between the staff and MHT to clarify that. The school district has a couple of options in terms of how they can complete those documents. So I believe those to be in process at this time.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Any other questions? All right, Michael, you read the motion?
Okay, the motion here is to approve the acquisition by the Frederick County Board of Education of 16.7 acres of land known as the Brunswick Crossing Development Elementary School site adjacent to Brunswick Elementary School on the west side of Petersville Road at tax map 202, parcel 776, and a portion of parcel 879, so that the Frederick County Board of Education may combine it with the existing school property to enable the construction of a school to replace the existing Brunswick Elementary School, adhering to the actions identified in the State Clearinghouse Review, State Identifier Number MD 2019-1115-0919.
All right, do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously, and we'll go on to section B.
Okay. The second item today is the property disposition in Somerset County of the Marion Sarah Peyton School, which, I guess to begin with, was constructed in 1971, opened in 1972, and addition was completed in 1980. As of 2003, the school had a state-rated capacity of 305. Shortly thereafter, the school was closed, and an alternative learning center for adults was opened in the facility in 2006. Recent improvements to the Board of Education building enabled the school district to transfer that program to that facility, and the Marion Sarah Peyton School is no longer needed for educational purposes. At this point, I believe the future use of the building has not been determined. However, I've heard that it's possibly going to be taken down once this process is complete. There is some state investment which we've identified of $1.3 million within the recent period. We do not yet have a repayment schedule from the Treasurer's office. That is being calculated and will be shared with the Board of Education when it's complete.
Okay, any questions? All right, would you read the motion, please?
Okay. In this case, the motion is to approve the transfer of the former Marion Sarah Peyton School located at 28573 Hudson Corner Road in Marion, Maryland, 21838, from the Somerset County Public Schools Board of Education to the Somerset County Commissioners as approved by the BOE on November 19th of 2019 for an undetermined future use, and to require repayment of the outstanding state bond debt as calculated by the State Treasurer's Office, consistent with Section 5-308 of the Education Article of the Annotated Code of Maryland.
Yes, Senator?
For a new person who doesn't know how this all works, so I see it says repayment of state debt, and it says state investment 1.3, and then it has outstanding state bond debt. What is that likely to be, that number, outstanding state bond debt?
That's probably a better question answered specifically by Kim.
Kim?
So, the amount of outstanding bond debt,
Move your microphone.
the amount of
Bend it down a little bit.
Bend it towards you.
okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. The amount of outstanding bond debt is based upon the bonds that were used for those expenditures and the amount that's still outstanding and what percentage that amount
What's the
might be.
1.385 represent?
So that represents the state's investment in construction projects at that school in the last 15 years.
You don't have to repay that.
No, it'll
just
be
repay the
some.
bond debt.
It'll be the amount that's not retired, and then that portion's percentage of that amount.
The way it works all the time.
Yes, that's correct. And we get that information from the state treasurer's office, so sometimes it takes a couple weeks for them to get to
Okay.
us.
Thanks.
That's all.
Very good. Thank you for that explanation. I think other people had that question too and were afraid to ask it. So thank you,
there-
Senator.
And it does, the county commissioners have up to 2 years from the time that the school is closed to repay that if there is any amount. And if it's less than 5,000, then it's immaterial and we don't require that. Just,
That's good to know.
But if I could add a point of clarification, if it were, for instance, a 30-year bond and only half had been repaid in that 15-year period. The goal is, the mark is that there's 15 years of use out of those bond proceeds. After that mark, even if all the bond is not retired, the local does not have to repay it. It's an investment, and it has made the 15-year expected life of the investment.
Okay, very good. All right, do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. Let's go to Section B, and this does not require, this is totally informational.
Yes.
Jamie? I'm sorry, it's Section 5. My B and 5 were stuck together.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. I'm before you to deliver item 5, an informational item, a status report on the extra $15 million for HVAC projects for Baltimore City, and then I will stand for follow-up questions. The item can be found on page 71 and 72 of the agenda, and it is current as of January 23rd, 2020. Starting out on project phase, we now have 7 projects that are operational. That's up from 2 the last time we spoke. We have no projects in construction, 8 in construction procurement, 4 in design, and none in design procurement. As far as status goes, we now have 16 projects that are either operational or not behind. We have 1 that is behind less than a month, 1 that is behind less than 2 months, and 1 that is behind greater than 2 months. And I will just take time to make note as far as exceptions go. I want to make mention of, in particular, Ben Franklin High School, number 239, the boiler replacement project. You'll see in the spreadsheet that the project is to be canceled, but in fact it is operational. That is because during the design period, the boiler failed, and so the LEA installed boilers from a swing building where extra BTUs were available. At the most recent facility planners meeting, we heard from LEAs from across the state that how emergencies often influence their capital priorities and sort of barge in from time to time. Baltimore City, having the oldest buildings in the state, certainly a good example of that, and this is a great example of how sometimes you have to do something fast. So if you look at there's before and after pictures down below. On the left, you'll see a Burnham boiler from circa 1980, and that was the one that was operational. And now next to it, you'll see the new boilers that were taken from the Garrison building and installed and are now operational. So, it's always a function of problem solving. There's a lot of problem solvers out there in Baltimore City and across the state doing stuff like this, keep the kids learning. And so I thought that was worth mentioning. Moving on to contract health, we have 19 projects with a total allocation of $14,686,397 out of $15 million. That is 97.9%. To date, we have 11 design contracts, total of $1,234,745. 6 construction contracts, total of $1,304,361. So total, we have 17 contracts, a little over $2.5 million, and 17.3% of the allocated value. As far as local match go, I do want to mention that there are 7 design contracts that exceed our allocation for design for the projects that the LEA is covering the difference to the extent of $523,000, which is about 42% of the $1.234 million that we have allocated for design. So, these are all very complicated projects. I guess part of the reason why is because old buildings have complicated projects, but also because we built this program so that it was flexible and allowed adjusting. And so This portfolio of projects is particularly challenging. Some of the buildings, looking at old buildings that have been repaired in a piecemeal fashion over years, much like Brunswick, that had new construction, a number of additions, renovations. So, oftentimes, for example, Thomas Johnson, that project is still in design. Like most HVAC projects in old facilities, it is complicated. This original scope was to replace the air handlers in the building that has been piecemealed over quite a bit of time. So, when design was initiated, they had to start looking at equipment they could use that would work with what they have and work with what they would like to have. And identified that they also needed to include new ductwork in the scope, as well as some new VAV terminal boxes. And while they're at it, they wanted to be able to control those air handlers through the backnet using building automation. And so, the scope on that was revised extensively in order to meet the needs of that building. And this is the kind of work that's going on. We see this now because these are 19 projects that we're tracking on the monthly basis, but this is how Baltimore City operates all their capital projects, because they do not do design before they receive an allocation. So they kick off this process in the same way. It's just that there is a lot less flexibility on the capital improvement
So
project.
Jamie, question, how long, and I know this is probably not a good question, but how long is too long for design to take?
How long is too long for design
You know what I'm
to
saying?
take?
And is there a range of time that we should expect that a design process should take? Because, there's just been some recent stuff in the newspaper, again, about Baltimore City and the dismal state of facilities. And I just want to make sure that we are all aware of what efforts are being made to move this forward, because, ultimately, the IAC is perceived as the place that can solve some of these construction issues, when in reality, we really need the locals to be working with us hand in hand. So I guess my question is within that frame of, how long is too long? And maybe Bob can answer that.
Yes, there's no correct answer. Too long on design is if you delay your construction dollars from starting to work immediately as soon as they are available. That's the goal of good facility management. You don't want to have your money sitting around losing value. So it depends on the project. The more experience that you have, the more you're able to estimate, looking at a type of project, whether the ducts need to be replaced, whether you're going to have to drop the ceilings, increase the structure for equipment. All of those things come from the early scoping as you identify the problem. You first have to identify the problem. That's that early planning part, and put a priority on which ones are the most important. And those are the kinds of problems that we repeatedly see, not just from Baltimore City. There is not a clear vision of what needs to be done first that is aligned with the dollars that will be available. But with that, in Baltimore City, where we've talked with them, they have these very high-need projects. Those designs should be starting probably in the neighborhood of at least a year ahead of time to understand what their needs are, but sometimes even further. If there are complications that we've seen, such as a school that has an HVAC or a roof problem that also has structural problems that are the root cause of the others. So it depends, but you have to look at it as early as you can and determine how much design time that you need to allocate. So when those dollars are available, they go to work.
Right. And I think we've made some suggestions to the city about how to deal with this. Do we know where that is?
Jamie?
We have, after we met at December IAC meeting, we did sit down with Baltimore City afterwards and talk about the matter that we'll call post-allocation design, and that is not designing projects until after you've received an allocation, which can often lead to insufficient budgets. It's sort of a big question, and so the LEA had started to work on categorizing their pipeline of projects in
This
a...
was our suggestion. Would you explain that first so that the rest of the IAC knows what we suggested, please?
We suggested that the LEA take their capital project pipeline and categorize each of those projects as complex, would definitely need design before allocation, moderately complex might need design before allocation, and not complex might not need design before allocation, so that we could then take a look at the cost estimates from our financial pipeline and start to think about what they would need if they were to initiate design before they received an allocation.
And wasn't it also to preclude delays and they could switch out projects if they needed to?
And that would absolutely be quite a benefit of that kind of doing design before allocation.
So as I remember that meeting, they agreed to do that. Where does that process stand now? Have we received their list?
No. Madam Chair, if I could, what we received was a back look at projects that have rescinded. They wanted, and I think it was helpful to learn why projects had rescinded in relationship to design. I think it was partly revealing that early design would have precluded some of it, but then there's also the partial funding question mark that has come up many times before that we have since resolved. Today, we don't have that list of their expected projects in the three buckets that we walked away from the meeting, but we are following up with them, and we hope to have that soon.
Do we need to write a letter? From the
Madam Chair,
IAC?
at this time, I don't think so. As of this morning, I see that there is an urgency from the city to have that meeting. We certainly implore them to try to put something together before we meet, so we're not talking about what we're going to do again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. I just wanted to make sure the rest of the IAC had knowledge of our pursuit of that issue since, as was described fairly specifically and dramatically by Secretary McCord, there is quite a need to get this issue settled.
And back to your original question, again, this is a pretty complex portfolio of projects that we're looking at, and right now we have, we have 7 projects that are operational, a bunch of them that are about ready to go to construction, and we did approve these projects, the allocations in February of 2019. So this represents some pretty fast action on behalf of Baltimore City, and some of the projects, the solutions that have been developed have been really creative and interesting, and will definitely help the students as soon as possible.
Very good.
Madam Chair, could I make another couple of
Absolutely.
comments, please? The article that the Sun came out with the 17% of the schools only in good, and those are not even, they're nowhere close to being valid facts. I was surprised that a research institution was attached to those being facts, because they're not. That 17% are the maintenance assessments that we have made. And you recall, we've switched to try to look at those facilities that are in the highest need. So with Baltimore having a large portfolio of needs, it is not their entire portfolio that number is attached to. It's the ones that we actually looked at. So it's not a valid number. I don't know if there's a difference for the entire portfolio. We just don't know, but it wasn't a fact. And that's disturbing because it puts, I feel, us and Baltimore City in a defensive position. And I have to say that Baltimore City has a big problem, and so do other LEAs, but they are working towards it. And one of the facts that is not reported, that we are putting in our MSA report, is that as we compare their maintenance effectiveness compared to years previous, they have improved more than any other LEA. It's something to brag about. They just have a big problem that they have to resolve. So I think it's worth saying that they are trying, but they have a big problem, and just like all of us, you become overwhelmed, and we're trying not to add to their angst and to be their partners, and we just hope that can occur.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll add on that research, it would be, it's pretty easy to note that it sort of lacked statistical rigor. For example, the 1.5 million hours, I believe. If you remove one day in the first week of January 2018 from that, it quickly takes that number down to, kids missed an average of 3 hours a year due to HVAC equipment failures. Back of the envelope calculations. That said, it is hard to take a argumentative state on that research because there is a problem. But it just, that's
Well, I think
that's not
that's
the
why
way.
it was good to have this discussion, because I want people to be aware of the facts, and Bob has clarified that, and as well as you have, Jamie. But I do think it remains to be a concern that we have to stay on and be vigilant about as an IAC organization. And so I think that's why we have you reporting to us every month, and that's why we have these very honest conversations. So thank you for bringing the information. Any other questions for Jamie? Secretary McCord?
Yeah. Again, I always start with thank you, Jamie, for keeping us abreast of what's going on. And the question is there any way to direct attention to something that falls behind, or are they directing attention to a project that's fallen behind more than 2 months?
The goal is, when I talk to the LEA about about float and recovery, generally at the end of the day, the bottom line is, will they have a boiler in place for winter? Will they have cooling in place for cooling season? And so that's their frame, and they are still on target to deliver items in front of the proper season. Again, like I said before, when you go from replacing some air handlers to replacing air handlers, ducts, VAV boxes, adding BAS capabilities, and they're actually increasing the scope of the project quite a bit. And so there would be there could be cases where that would stretch out the timeline, but in general, they're on track for making those seasons.
All right, thank you.
Secretary, the short answer, and Secretary Churchill will say, is that the iron triangle of project delivery is time, money, and quality. Which one don't you want? So whenever we are in a condition like this where it's more complex and they don't have any more money, there's not much you can do. You just don't want to get into this position to begin with and give yourself the time early.
Secretary Churchill?
Yes, Jamie, thank you. I first want to thank you for providing the photos of the
Yeah, that's really
boilers.
helpful.
That's a very dated, antiquated boiler.
Sure.
And I believe the city is probably very fortunate to have a boiler of recent ilk to be able to be installed. So I have two questions. On Benjamin Franklin, which is what these pictures are about, there are sunk costs on this for, I guess, there were contracts $67,000. The total allocation was $717,000. How does the city deal with this? Does the $717,000 pay for the emergency projects? Does it come out of a different fund, or do these funds get dispersed to other projects?
The emergency replacement was covered by local capital. So they will cancel the project and revert the entirety of the construction contract back into the extra $15 million fund, which
The
they will.
entirety, even the design cost that...
Not the design cost. That is the sunk cost. But they will be able to revert that construction money, and then, in all likelihood, to apply it to a Thomas Johnson or or Windsor Hills project that has an expanded scope.
All right. I see that there are two projects that have changed in status for in the negative. I'm not so concerned about Westport, but back to Secretary McCord's point. When I look at Harlem Park, which is a project that's in design development, that if we talk about the right window of opportunity to install, we're talking about construction, and these dates may need to be refreshed. December of this year, going out for a year. Is the city giving you any indication as to some additional technical difficulties that are a part of the project? I mean, are they finding hazmat that they didn't have? It's always interesting to see a project that is going south. South is probably a bad word. It can be recovered in the design process this early.
Harlem Park definitely is a building that's got some hazmats, although that was anticipated. The challenge with Harlem Park project right now is coordination with local utilities. And on a very, more detailed level, just turnover at a local utility has made some coordination challenging, and so they're working through that as well as planning for a pretty complicated project.
Certainly can understand that. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, any other questions for Jamie? Thank you, Jamie, appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, now we're going to move to Section 6, and Cassandra's going to do legislative updates.
Madam Chair, for the clarity of the record, before we move on, if we could backtrack. Typically, the IAC approves a consent agenda. I think this morning we specifically referenced the minutes. So
Oh, we
just to make
did.
sure that the
Yes.
record is clear, could we go back and vote on
Yes,
item
we
1B
can.
for contracts?
Yes. Sorry about that. I was getting ahead of myself. So if we could have a motion to approve the consent agenda,
So moved. I had that noted too. Thank you.
and do we have a second? Second. All right, we have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Cassandra. And now you may begin the legislative update.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as you know, session is always in flux, which is why you just got a handout of the changes that have occurred since we published the IAC agenda last week. Throughout the session, we're going to provide you a legislative update at each meeting. So far, of course, no legislation has passed. This is all preliminary. It's just been introduced. So I'll stay at a very high level for the next couple of months until things start getting enacted. So at a very high level, the things that we're really looking at right now are, of course, House Bill 1 and House Bill 338, which are the Build to Learn Act and the Building Opportunity Act, both of which authorize the Maryland Stadium Authority to sell more than $2 billion in revenue bonds that will essentially fund additional CIP projects. They will be reviewed by the commission and approved by the commission, and then those projects may be carried out by MSA or may be carried out by the locals, depending on how the bill is structured that finally passes. So that's something that we have our eye on. We're also tracking several bills that change the definition of an elevated level of lead. We're watching this because it will impact the procedures for the Healthy School Facility Fund, which has at least one more year. We'll implement that fund, the use of that fund again in FY21, and potentially could be extended by some of the legislation that we've seen. You might remember that last year we considered lead projects that were above 20 parts per billion high priority, and we would fund other lead projects they were eligible under 20 down to 5. Most of this legislation takes the elevated level of lead down to that 5 parts per billion. And there are a few other miscellaneous bills that I won't go into detail on, but if you have any questions about these now or at any time during the session, I'm happy to answer them.
All right. So we just take a second to look over these and see if you have any questions. Secretary Churchill.
I don't have a question now. I think I'm going to let the bill process take its course. I would have a question about SB 0655. Not to be answered today.
That was just introduced 2 days ago,
Yes.
and we are working on our fiscal note to respond to that, just so the members are aware.
And Madam Chair, if I could, as we're looking at fiscal notes, it's very difficult. We've got to just get the facts out there, and so it's a difficult process. And a couple of them, like PV collectors at every square inch of every school, we're trying to paint the picture. In other words, geothermal, paint the picture that one shoe doesn't fit all. And that as the legislation is developed, we're trying to give enough information so that there's some flexibility that can be considered from the total cost of ownership standpoint, so that we don't paint ourselves further into a corner with things that don't produce the value that I know is intended by the sponsors.
other questions for Cassandra? Secretary, report?
Cassandra, I don't know our history as a commission of testifying,
We have
weighing
none.
in. No, I mean, I know.
We can create the history.
But there may be situations that our fiscal note response actually suggest potentially amendment that would make it more livable. And I'm not going to pretend to be the legislative liaison for the IAC, but sometimes it's not a yes and a no. Sometimes the information that we provide helps the legislator understand what's going on. And sometimes we may suggest that if it was amended this way, it would be livable.
Okay.
So I think we need to think about
I
not
think-
just yes and no.
Right, and those kinds of things can be run through, back through
Yeah.
here.
So, Madam Chair, if I could, typically, we don't testify at legislative hearings unless we are asked to.
Right.
But one opportunity that the legislative process gives us is to provide letters of information, where our fiscal note is distilled by DLS into one fiscal note for the legislation. The letters of information we provide are provided before a hearing, and those are given directly to the legislators so that they have important information at their disposal right there as they're learning about the bill. So that is something that we have done in the past on certain pieces of legislation. There was a bill last year that would have required that the IAC assess, for example, sports facilities, which is a very difficult thing to create standards for. And we did provide a letter of information explaining the complexity of something like that. So we do take that opportunity from time to time when we feel that the legislators would benefit from a more direct piece of correspondence from the IEC.
And I think to Bob's point, though, just like the state board will take a position to support or not support a bill, I think the IAC can do the same thing. I don't see any difference in the way that that's set up. So if we have a great, desire and we see something that's incredibly complex that we know that we can't handle, we may want to have an IAC and support or not support that particular bill or with amendments.
I'm not necessarily advocating for that. We're fortunate to have two former legislators on our commission. We have department heads that have to respond to legislation in the ways that we do anyway, and we have members of the public that are part of the commission. I just want to make sure that we understand that sometimes it's not a yes and a no, and the letter of information is a perfectly valid way to get our concerns across. So I appreciate the explanation. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, any other questions for Cassandra? Okay, and so now I believe that I need something from Elliot. Since I don't memorize this information very well. Thank you, sir. So that concludes our public meeting for today, and I would like to make a motion, or have a motion that we go into closed session to discuss the appointment, employment, assignment, promotion, discipline, demotion, compensation, removal, resignation, or performance evaluation of appointees, employees, or officials over whom the public body has jurisdiction, any other personnel matters that affect one or more specific individuals, and also to consult with counsel to obtain legal advice. So may I have a motion?
So moved.
We have a second?
Second.
All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Thank you so much. We'll go into the board caucus room.